Hello, I'm Bill from Great American Classics. Today we're talking about the courageous men and women who shaped our history through sacrifice, resilience, and determination. Our topic today is German aces mocked the P-51 Mustang until 200 of them appeared over Berlin. And in this story, we'll reflect on what they endured, what they accomplished, and what their legacy still means for us today. The North American P-51 Mustang stands as one of the most significant aircraft in American military history. A fighter plane that fundamentally altered the course of the air war over Europe during World War II. To understand its impact, we must first understand the desperate situation American bomber crews faced in the skies over Nazi-occupied Europe in 1943, and the long, difficult road that led to the Mustang's transformation from a capable but limited fighter into the war-winning machine that would escort American bombers all the way to Berlin and back. In the early years of America's involvement in World War II, the United States Army Air Forces committed to a strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany that was unprecedented in scale and ambition. The theory behind strategic bombing held that destroying Germany's industrial capacity, transportation networks, and oil production would cripple the Nazi war machine and bring the conflict to an end more quickly, saving lives that would otherwise be lost in prolonged ground campaigns. American planners believed that heavily armed bombers flying in tight formations could defend themselves against enemy fighters through concentrated defensive fire from their numerous machine guns. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and consolidated B-24 Liberator were the primary instruments of this campaign. Four-engine heavy bombers capable of carrying substantial bomb loads deep into enemy territory. Each B-17 bristled with defensive machine guns, and when flown in the combat box formations developed by American tacticians, these bombers could create overlapping fields of fire that theoretically made them difficult targets for enemy fighters. But theory and reality proved to be different things when American bombers began flying deep penetration raids into Germany in 1943. The Luftwaffe, Germany's Air Force, had been hardened by years of combat and possessed experienced pilots flying capable fighter aircraft, including the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190. These German fighters attacked American bomber formations with determination and tactical sophistication, and the losses among American bomber crews began to mount at alarming rates. The fundamental problem was range. American fighter aircraft of the early war period simply could not escort the bombers all the way to distant targets deep in Germany and return safely to bases in England. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was a rugged and powerful fighter, well loved by its pilots for its ability to absorb punishment and dive away from trouble, but its range was limited. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, a twin-engine fighter with distinctive twin booms, had better range, but performed poorly at high altitudes in the cold European skies, suffering from engine problems and inadequate cockpit heating that left pilots struggling with frostbite and reduced effectiveness. Without fighter escort for the entire mission, American bombers flew unprotected through the most dangerous portions of their routes, and German fighters exploited this vulnerability mercilessly. Bomber crews faced the horrifying experience of watching Luftwaffe fighters mass ahead of their formations, then attack in waves, focusing their fire on individual bombers until they fell from the sky, trailing smoke and flame. The loss rates on some missions exceeded 10%, a mathematically unsustainable figure given that bomber crews were required to complete 25 missions before they could return home. The statistical reality was grim. Crew members calculated their odds of survival and found them wanting. The pressure on American air commanders to find a solution was immense, both from a strategic standpoint and from a moral obligation to the men they were sending into harm's way. The P-51 Mustang's origins lay not in American military planning, but in a British requirement and an American manufacturer's willingness to take a risk. In 1940, with Britain standing alone against Nazi Germany and desperate for aircraft to replace losses suffered during the Battle of France and the early stages of the Battle of Britain, the Royal Air Force approached North American aviation about building P-40 fighters under license for British use. North American aviation's chief designer, Edgar Schmood, made a bold counteroffer. Rather than simply building someone else's design, Schmood proposed that North American could design and build a completely new fighter aircraft in less time than it would take to set up production of the P-40. This was an audacious claim, given the complexity of modern fighter aircraft design. But North American had earned a reputation for efficient engineering and rapid production. The British, skeptical but intrigued, agreed to purchase the new fighter if North American could deliver a prototype within 120 days. Edgar Schmood and his team worked with remarkable speed, incorporating lessons learned from earlier fighter designs and utilizing the most advanced aerodynamic principles available. The resulting aircraft, initially designated the NA-73, featured a laminar flow wing design that reduced drag and gave the aircraft exceptional speed and range. The fuselage was carefully shaped to minimize aerodynamic resistance, and the overall design emphasized efficiency and performance. North American delivered the prototype in just 102 days, an achievement that spoke to both the company's organizational capabilities and the brilliance of Schmood's engineering team. The British named the aircraft Mustang, and initial flight tests revealed an aircraft with extraordinary speed and handling characteristics. However, the original Mustang had a critical limitation. It was powered by an Allison V1710 engine, an American-designed inline engine that performed well at low and medium altitudes, but lost power rapidly at the high altitudes where bomber escort missions were fought. The Allison engine lacked an effective supercharger for high-altitude operations, which meant that while the early Mustangs excelled at low-level ground attack and reconnaissance missions, they were unsuited for the high-altitude bomber escort role that was becoming increasingly critical. The British put their Mustangs to work in ground attack and tactical reconnaissance roles, where the aircraft's speed, range, and handling made it valuable. But it remained a peripheral aircraft in the overall air war, not the game-changing weapon that was desperately needed. The transformation came through the marriage of the Mustang's superb airframe with a different engine. British engineer Ronald Harker, a test pilot working for Rolls-Royce, flew a Mustang equipped with the Allison engine in April 1942 and immediately recognized that the aircraft's aerodynamic qualities were extraordinary. Harker understood that if the Mustang could be mated with a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that had powered the Spitfire and Hurricane to victory in the Battle of Britain, the result would be a fighter of unprecedented capability. The Merlin engine featured sophisticated two-stage supercharging that allowed it to maintain power at high altitudes, exactly what the Mustang needed to become an effective high-altitude fighter. Rolls-Royce undertook the conversion work, installing a Merlin engine in a Mustang airframe, and the results exceeded even optimistic expectations. The Merlin-powered Mustang was faster than the original version, with a top speed exceeding 440 miles per hour, and it maintained excellent performance at the altitudes where bomber escort missions were fought, typically between 25,000 and 30,000 feet. Crucially, the Mustang's aerodynamic efficiency meant that it consumed fuel more slowly than other fighters, giving it extraordinary range, the Achilles heel that had plagued earlier escort fighters. American military observers took notice of the British tests, and North American aviation began producing Mustangs powered by the Packard V-1650, an American-licensed version of the Merlin engine. The Army Air Forces designated these improved aircraft the P-51B and P-51C, and they began reaching operational units in late 1943 and early 1944. Even with the improved performance, some officers remained skeptical about the Mustang's ability to match the combat-proven German fighters in aerial combat. The P-51's armament of 4 or 6 50-caliber machine guns was lighter than the 8 guns carried by the P-47 Thunderbolt, and some questioned whether the Mustang's relatively lightweight construction could withstand combat damage as well as the rugged Thunderbolt. German pilots, veterans of years of aerial combat on both the Eastern and Western fronts, had earned reputations as among the most skilled fighter pilots in the world. Many Luftwaffe aces had scored dozens or even hundreds of aerial victories, and they flew from well-established bases with extensive ground support and radar networks that gave them tactical advantages in defending their homeland. These experienced German pilots had faced and defeated multiple generations of Allied fighters, and there was no particular reason for them to fear yet another American aircraft type entering service. Historical records suggest that German pilots initially viewed the Mustang as simply another Allied fighter, capable but not fundamentally different from the Thunderbolts and Lightnings they had been fighting. Reports from German pilots in late 1943 and early 1944 noted the Mustang's speed and maneuverability, but did not express particular alarm. The Luftwaffe had adapted to each new Allied aircraft type that appeared, developing tactics that exploited weaknesses and avoided strengths, and there seemed no reason this aircraft would prove different. The situation began to change dramatically in the spring of 1944 as American fighter groups transitioned to Mustangs and the aircraft began appearing in large numbers over Germany. The first long-range escort missions demonstrated the Mustang's revolutionary capability. On March 4, 1944, P-51s escorted bombers all the way to Berlin for the first time, a mission that would have been impossible for earlier American fighters. The psychological impact on both sides was immediate and profound. For American bomber crews, the sight of friendly fighters accompanying them throughout their missions transformed the experience of combat. Instead of facing the terrifying prospect of flying unescorted through the most dangerous portions of their routes, bomber crews now had protection from takeoff to landing. The presence of Mustangs forced German fighters to engage the escorts rather than concentrating on the bombers, and even when German pilots broke through to attack the bomber formations, they had to worry about Mustangs diving on them from above. Morale among bomber crews, which had suffered badly during the unescorted missions of 1943, began to recover as loss rates declined. For German pilots and commanders, the appearance of large formations of American fighters over German cities represented a catastrophic development. The Luftwaffe had based its defensive strategy on the assumption that American fighters could not escort bombers to distant targets, and entire tactical systems had been built around this assumption. German fighters would wait until American escort fighters reached the limit of their range and turned back, then mass for coordinated attacks on the unprotected bombers. The arrival of the Mustang shattered this strategy completely. German fighters now faced the prospect of engaging American fighters throughout the entire bomber mission, and the Mustang proved fully capable of matching or exceeding the performance of German fighters in combat. The aerial battles over Germany in the spring and summer of 1944 demonstrated the Mustang's combat effectiveness. In dogfights, the P-51 could turn with the nimble Bf-109, outdive the FW-190, and outrun both German fighter types in level flight. The Mustang's excellent visibility from the cockpit, with its bubble canopy providing unobstructed views in all directions on later models, gave American pilots a significant advantage in spotting enemy aircraft. The aircraft's harmonized controls, meaning that all control surfaces responded proportionally to pilot inputs throughout the aircraft's speed range, made it an excellent gun platform and gave pilots confidence in violent maneuvering during combat. Perhaps most importantly, the Mustang's range meant that American fighters could now hunt German fighters throughout German airspace. American commanders adopted an aggressive policy that encouraged fighter pilots to pursue German aircraft to their bases and strafe Luftwaffe aircraft on the ground. This strategy, controversial because it exposed American fighters to German anti-aircraft fire, inflicted devastating losses on the Luftwaffe. German fighters were destroyed on the ground before they could take off, and the pilots who managed to take off faced the constant threat of being attacked while landing, when they were most vulnerable, low on fuel and ammunition after combat. The numbers tell the story of the Mustang's impact. In 1943, before the Mustang entered service in significant numbers, the 8th Air Force flying from England lost 176 bombers in October alone during missions to targets in Germany. By the summer of 1944, with Mustangs providing escort, loss rates had dropped dramatically, even as the number and depth of missions increased. The Luftwaffe, which had begun the war with a cadre of superbly trained pilots, found itself unable to replace losses among experienced pilots, and training programs struggled to prepare new pilots adequately in the face of fuel shortages and constant Allied air attacks. Young German pilots with minimal training went into combat against experienced American pilots flying superior aircraft, and the results were predictably one-sided. The testimonies of German pilots from this period reveal a growing sense of desperation and the recognition that the air war had turned decisively against them. While some German aces continued to score victories through superior skill and experience, the average Luftwaffe pilot faced increasingly long odds. German pilot Johannes Steinhoff, who survived the war and later served in the West German Luftwaffe, wrote in his memoirs about the growing futility of German fighter operations in 1944, describing missions where German fighters were outnumbered by American escorts and struggled simply to survive encounters rather than effectively defending against bomber formations. The sheer scale of American fighter operations overwhelmed German defenses. On major missions, several hundred P-51s might accompany American bomber formations, and these fighters operated not just as close escorts staying with the bombers, but as roving patrols that swept ahead of the bomber stream and hunted German fighters wherever they could be found. German ground controllers attempting to coordinate fighter interceptions found their pilots engaged by Mustangs before they could reach the bombers, and the careful tactical systems that had made the Luftwaffe so effective in earlier years broke down under the pressure of constant combat against a numerically superior and technically equal opponent. The title of this narration references German aces mocking the P-51 until hundreds appeared over Berlin, and while the phrasing is somewhat dramatic, it captures a fundamental truth about the Mustang's impact. The appearance of large formations of American long-range fighters over the German capital in early 1944 represented a turning point in the air war, a moment when it became clear that the Luftwaffe could no longer effectively defend German airspace. Berlin, the political and symbolic heart of Nazi Germany, had been considered beyond the reach of American day fighters, and its appearance over the city demonstrated that nowhere in Germany was safe from American air attack. The specific date of March 4, 1944, marks the first large-scale American fighter escort mission to Berlin. a historic mission that proved the strategic value of the Mustang. More than 170 P-51s accompanied bombers to Berlin that day, a number that seemed almost impossible to German defenders who had grown accustomed to American fighters turning back hundreds of miles before reaching the capital. The psychological impact of this mission reverberated through both the Luftwaffe and the German civilian population. Berlin residents who had watched British bombers attack their city at night now witnessed American heavy bombers attacking in daylight, protected by swarms of fighter aircraft that bore the distinctive white stars of the United States Army Air Forces. The combat effectiveness of the Mustang derived not simply from its technical characteristics, but from the skill and courage of the American pilots who flew it. These young men, many barely out of their teens, underwent rigorous training before being sent to combat units in Europe. Fighter pilot training emphasized aerial gunnery, formation flying, and combat tactics, and by 1944, the American training system was producing capable pilots in large numbers. While they typically lacked the extensive combat experience of veteran Luftwaffe pilots, American pilots benefited from superior numbers, better logistics, and the knowledge that if they were shot down over friendly territory or managed to bail out over England or Allied-controlled areas, they would return to duty, rather than spending the rest of the war in a prisoner-of-war camp. The stories of individual Mustang pilots illustrate the human dimension of the air war. Men like George Preddy, who scored 26.83 victories flying Mustangs and became one of the top American aces in Europe before his death in a tragic friendly fire incident on Christmas Day 1944, represented the best of American fighter pilots. Preddy's tactical skill and aggressive fighting spirit made him a legend among his fellow pilots, and his loss highlighted the random cruelty of war. He was shot down not by German fighters but by American anti-aircraft gunners who misidentified his aircraft during a low-level pursuit of German fighters. Don Gentile, another highly successful Mustang pilot, scored 21.83 victories and became famous enough that he was sent back to the United States for public relations purposes, his boyish good looks and combat record making him an ideal symbol of American air power for the home front. The diversity of backgrounds among Mustang pilots reflected the breadth of American society. Pilots came from farms and cities, from wealthy families and working-class homes, from every region of the country. The Tuskegee Airmen, African-American pilots who faced discrimination and segregation at home, but served with distinction in combat, flew Mustangs with the 332nd Fighter Group and earned a formidable reputation for their skill and dedication. These pilots faced the dual burden of proving themselves in combat while challenging the racist assumptions that had nearly prevented their participation in the war. And they succeeded on both counts, compiling an excellent combat record and helping to pave the way for the eventual integration of the American military. The ground crews who maintained the Mustangs deserve recognition alongside the pilots who flew them. Keeping high-performance aircraft operational in wartime conditions required skilled mechanics, armorers, and support personnel who worked long hours in all weather conditions to ensure their aircraft were ready for combat. These enlisted men rarely received the recognition accorded to pilots, but their contribution was essential to the Mustang's success. An aircraft with mechanical problems was useless regardless of its design excellence, and the dedication of ground crews to keeping their fighters flying represented a crucial but often overlooked element of American air power. The Mustang's impact extended beyond its direct combat effectiveness. The psychological effect of losing air superiority affected German morale at every level. Civilians in German cities could see American fighters circling overhead in daylight, a constant reminder of Germany's declining fortunes. German soldiers on the ground, whether fighting on the Eastern Front against Soviet forces or in France after D-Day against Western allies, could no longer count on air support from the Luftwaffe and instead faced constant threat from Allied aircraft. The German war economy, subjected to relentless bombardment by American heavy bombers escorted by Mustangs, struggled to maintain production of weapons, ammunition, and fuel. While historians continue to debate the precise contribution of strategic bombing to Germany's defeat, there is consensus that the combined bomber offensive, made possible by fighters like the Mustang, placed enormous strain on German resources and contributed significantly to the Allied victory. The evolution of the P-51 continued throughout the war. The P-51D model, introduced in 1944, featured the distinctive bubble canopy that became the Mustang's most recognizable feature, providing even better visibility than earlier models. This version carried 6 50-caliber machine guns and could be equipped with bombs or rockets for ground attack missions, making it a versatile weapon system. The P-51H, a lighter variant with even better performance, entered production near the end of the war in Europe and was intended for service in the Pacific Theater, though the war ended before it could see significant combat against Japanese forces. The costs of the air war remained high, even with the Mustang's advantages. American pilots were still shot down, killed, or captured, and bomber losses, while reduced, continued throughout the war. The Luftwaffe, even in its weakened state, remained dangerous, and individual German aces, flying superior aircraft like the Me-262 jet fighter, which entered service late in the war, could still inflict significant damage on American formations. The spring and summer of 1944 saw fierce aerial combat as the Luftwaffe attempted to resist the Allied invasion of Normandy and the subsequent campaign in France. Mustang pilots flew grueling schedules, sometimes multiple missions per day, and the strain of combat flying took its toll even on those who survived physically unscathed. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the P-51 Mustang had established itself as one of the war's most important aircraft. Production numbers reflected its value. North American Aviation and other manufacturers built more than 15,000 Mustangs during the war, and the aircraft served not just with the United States Army Air Forces, but with numerous Allied air forces. The Royal Air Force continued to operate Mustangs throughout the war, as did other Allied nations who received aircraft through Lend-Lease or other programs. After the war, many air forces around the world continued to fly Mustangs, and some remained in service into the jet age, a testament to the soundness of the basic design. The legacy of the Mustang extends beyond its combat record. The aircraft demonstrated the importance of range in fighter design, a lesson that would influence American fighter development for decades. The Mustang's combination of speed, maneuverability, and range became the standard against which other fighters were measured, and the aircraft's success validated the American approach to fighter design that emphasized versatility and practical combat effectiveness over specialized performance in narrow areas. The men who flew and maintained the Mustang earned their place in American history through their sacrifice and dedication. They were young men who left homes, families, and promising futures to serve their country in a time of global crisis. Many did not return, their names now inscribed on memorials to the fallen, or in the quiet cemeteries of Europe, where American war dead rest far from home. Those who survived carried the memories of combat for the rest of their lives, memories of friends lost, of moments of terror and triumph, of the responsibility they felt to their fellow crewmen and to the cause they served. The air war over Europe represented a distinct form of combat, one that combined cutting-edge technology with individual courage and skill. Unlike the grinding attrition of ground combat, air battles were brief, violent, and decisive, often lasting only minutes, but determining whether bomber crews would survive to complete their missions or whether German fighters would tear formations apart. The P-51 Mustang gave American pilots the tools they needed to win these battles. But tools alone were not enough. Victory required the courage to climb into a fighter aircraft day after day, knowing that every mission might be the last, and the skill to use that aircraft effectively against determined opponents who were fighting to defend their homeland. The question of how much credit the Mustang deserves for Allied victory in the air war is complex, and historians have debated this question for decades. The aircraft certainly played a crucial role in turning the tide of the bomber offensive and destroying the Luftwaffe's ability to defend German airspace. But the Mustang was part of a larger system that included capable bombers, effective tactics, superior logistics, and, most importantly, the courage and determination of the men who flew combat missions over enemy territory. Technology alone never wins wars. It is the human beings who use that technology and who are willing to risk everything for their cause who ultimately determine outcomes. The Mustang's story is fundamentally an American story, one that reflects the nation's industrial capacity, innovative spirit, and the bravery of ordinary citizens called to extraordinary service. The aircraft embodied American strengths: practical engineering focused on solving real problems, efficient production methods that could deliver complex machines in large quantities, and a willingness to challenge accepted wisdom and try new approaches. These same qualities that made the Mustang successful were reflected throughout the American war effort, from the shipyards that produced merchant vessels and warships at astonishing rates, to the factories that built tanks, trucks, and weapons in quantities that amazed both allies and enemies. When we look back at the P-51 Mustang and the men who flew it, we remember a time when the nation faced an existential threat from forces that sought to extinguish freedom and human dignity. The response of ordinary Americans to that threat, whether by enlisting in military service, working in defense industries, or supporting the war effort at home, demonstrated the strength of free people united in defense of their values. The pilots who flew Mustangs over Germany were not professional warriors for the most part. They were citizens in uniform who would return to civilian life after the war and build careers, raise families, and contribute to their communities. But when their country called, they answered, and they performed their duties with a courage and skill that earned the respect even of their enemies. The technical achievement represented by the Mustang reminds us that American innovation and engineering excellence, when properly directed and supported, can solve problems that seem insurmountable. The transformation of the Mustang from a capable but limited fighter into a war-winning weapons system happened because talented engineers, test pilots, and military officers were willing to challenge conventional thinking and try unconventional solutions. This same spirit of innovation has characterized American achievements throughout our history, from the earliest days of the Republic through the present day, and it remains one of the nation's greatest strengths. As we reflect on the air war over Europe and the role of the P-51 Mustang, we must also remember the broader context in which these events occurred. World War II was a global conflict that cost tens of millions of lives and reshaped the world in fundamental ways. The victory achieved by the United States and its allies came at tremendous cost, not just in American lives, but in the suffering endured by peoples around the world. The bomber offensive that the Mustang made possible killed hundreds of thousands of German civilians, in addition to destroying industrial and military targets, a toll that, even in the context of total war against a regime as evil as Nazi Germany, should be remembered soberly rather than celebrated triumphantly. The men who flew these missions understood the weight of what they were doing, and many struggled after the war with memories of the destruction they had inflicted. The Mustang's place in American memory is secure, not because it was a perfect weapon or because the air war was conducted without error or moral complexity, but because it represents a moment when American ingenuity and courage met a genuine threat to human freedom and prevailed. The young men who flew P-51s over Germany were fighting against a regime that had murdered millions of innocent people, that had launched a war of conquest across Europe, and that represented a genuine threat to the values of human dignity, freedom, and democracy that Americans held dear. These pilots and the men who supported them were not fighting for conquest or domination. They were fighting to restore freedom to nations under occupation and to end a regime that had committed crimes against humanity on an unprecedented scale. When the war ended and American forces returned home, they did not seek to hold territory or establish an empire. The United States helped rebuild the nations it had fought against, including Germany, and worked to establish a peaceful international order. This pattern of American behavior, fighting when necessary but seeking peace and reconciliation after victory, reflects values that deserve respect and remembrance. The men who flew Mustangs contributed to a cause larger than themselves, and their legacy includes not just their combat achievements, but their role in defending principles that remain vital today. The P-51 Mustang itself endures as a symbol of American air power and engineering achievement. Many of these aircraft survived the war and have been lovingly restored by aviation enthusiasts who recognize their historical significance and appreciate their elegant design and impressive performance. At air shows around the country, the sound of a Merlin engine powering a Mustang in flight still thrills audiences and reminds us of the men who flew these aircraft in combat. These flying examples serve as living memorials to the pilots who died flying Mustangs and to all who served in the air war over Europe. This has been another story from Great American Classics. We pause once more to honor and remember the men and women who gave so much, and in many cases everything, in service to this country we love. Their courage and sacrifice are not forgotten, and their legacy continues to shape the freedoms we enjoy today.